The first 5 verses are the first revelation. Meaning that when Jibreel alayhi salam came to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, these first 5 are the 5 that he revealed. Allama al-insana ma lam ya'lam, that was the first revelation. The part that came after was it was at a different time. And then it was added to this. So the revelation would come sometimes as a whole, such as Surat al-Fatiha. It would come down as one whole. Sometimes just a few verses of a surah will come down, such as here, Surah Iqra. Sometimes part of an ayah, sometimes just one ayah would be revealed, other times part of an ayah would be revealed. Like for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would say something, and then someone may ask a question, and then the verse would be, except those who are, for example, incapable of doing this. So there would be like a istithna, like a illa alladhina, for example. And that would be a separate revelation just there at the end. The first revelation here is Iqra. Out of all the things, whenever a person, like, in any speech, the first thing that a person says, the last thing they say, are the most important parts of the speech. Things in the middle, and this is actually, even in the seminar, you'll forget everything in the middle, but you'll remember a lot of times what was said in the beginning, remember a lot of times what was said in the end. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of all the words to begin His revelation to humanity, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala began with Iqra, began with read. And like we said in our profile, and we said the name was what? Abdul Shams. So Abdul Shams, this person named Abdul Shams, he's a merchant, middle class, and he sees that the first call is Iqra. If he was a slave, for example, a lot of the slaves would be illiterate. If he was of noble status, he would understand the importance of this knowledge. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is calling the people to read and to learn, and a call to education. So right there we learn that knowledge and the seeking of knowledge is a core part of our deen. And the deen is not about people closing their minds and people shutting down and just, they'll say lying down and submitting to everything that was being said. But the deen is about seeking knowledge and acquiring knowledge. The second thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about is the creation of humans. خَلَقَ الْإِنسَانِ. And what we're going to learn there is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes Himself as this, Allah Azza wa Jalla says, who is this Lord? الَّذِي خَلَقَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created everything. But He chose to describe Himself. And if I give, for example, we say, Fahad. Right? If we said, like some noble person says, I'm the one who raised Fahad. Say like President Bush or something. I'll say, I paid for Brother Fahad's tuition. And he said this on CNN in front of everybody. And then the brother would be like, very honored that such a high, lofty status person would say something like that. Alright? وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes Himself as creating something, that raises the status of what He describes Him with. So, one of the questions on the exam was, show a way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the nobility of human creation. This is one of the ways. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of all the creation, said, خَلَقَ الْإِنسَانِ. That He is the Lord who created the human being in alaq. Here, in the word alaq, and alaq means like something that clings, and it's, a lot of times it's, like it says, coagulated blood or something like that. And if you look in, when you have those Qur'an and science lectures, these are verses that they go to frequently. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the creation of human beings in such precise terms that if you actually saw under a microscope, the womb of the mother and the embryo and so on, you will see it going through these stages of a congealed, al-alaq, something that clings, and that's what the baby does, it goes to the side. Now, inshallah, I'm going to be mentioning some of those Quranic sciences here and there. However, growing up, a lot of times when people would give tafsir, their tafsir was about Qur'an and sciences. So they would go to verse 31, everybody would go through their book and say, look here at the mountains, go to page, 265, and here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the rivers. And a lot of people, I think you've been in lectures like that, and you've heard lectures about the Qur'an and sciences and whatnot. However, the Qur'an isn't necessarily a science book. It's a book of guidance, it's a book of hidayah. And a lot of times we get preoccupied in those. Of course, they're there to reflect, but reflect on, to go beyond that reflection and actually see the truth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us behind these verses. And so it's not just about picking out one verse, and that's not going to be my style, inshaAllah, when I explain this, but I want to give you the message, in the face of the verses, what is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us. In verse 4, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the one who taught man with the pen, taught man with the qalam, عَلَّمَ الْإِنسَانَ مَا لَمْ يَعْلَمْ. And all throughout history, people were learning things through the pen. People would write things down, people would take notes and learn. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught them. But there's another way of learning, and that is, عَلَّمَ الْإِنسَانِ. He taught human beings مَا لَمْ يَعْلَمْ, what they did not know. So for example, someone like, someone who would discover gravity, he didn't necessarily read it, but an apple comes down, knocks him on the head. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that teaches them that. So it doesn't come from pen, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can bless someone with knowledge, even though it's not coming from pen. So these are the two types of knowledge. And actually, those two categories, and you may have heard in some of my speeches bringing this up, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, saying when someone comments on the deen, he's either doing verse 4 or verse 5. Either he's narrating something from the books of fiqh. So he says, for example, Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala said so-and-so. Allama bil qalam. Right? So that knowledge came to a person through pen, or he's making something up. Allama al-insana ma lam ya'lam. For example, a person may say, there's a sixth prayer, for example, and he's not getting it from anything written, but he's making it up. So it could be something from his own mind, or it could be something that he's citing from a different source. If someone comes to you, they're either citing something, or they're either making it up. If they are citing it, then you must ask them for their sources. So if they said, Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala said this, say, how do you know he said it? How do you know? And then he'll say, if I go to book Fathul Qadir, so-and-so narrates from Abu Hanifa that he said so-and-so. Okay, he has a citation where he got it from. If someone says, no, Abu Hanifa didn't say it, I discovered this, and so on, then he needs daleel. He needs proof. To see that if it truly comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if someone made something up, they would say, where is your proof in the deen that this is the correct method? And he would say, if you look at verse so-and-so, it says this, like you might see about communism and whatnot, coming up in the verse, someone may have come to that conclusion and used certain verses as their proof, even though they made it up, but it's based on the Qur'an and Sunnah. So summing that up, either the person is citing something, if he's citing it, then he needs a citation, or he's making it up, then he needs daleel for what he's saying. You have to realize here in this, عَلَّمَ الْإِنسَانَ مَا لَمْ يَعْلَمْ, the Prophet ﷺ was unlettered, and he didn't know how to read, and he didn't know how to write. How does someone like that learn? And if you've ever had any experience with unlettered people, you realize, and I remember in Medina once, there was a sign, a parking sign, that said like, no parking here. So the taxi driver had said to me, what does the sign say? And I thought, like, just read it. It's right in front of you. Like, literally, it was like right there, he's standing here, and he's telling me, what does the sign say? I said, it's right there. And then he made the request a few times to me, and then at that moment I realized that he couldn't read the sign. And so you imagine life, put yourself in the shoes of someone like that, or the sandals of someone who doesn't read. How do they learn? How do they learn? The Prophet ﷺ was unlettered. So the Qur'an, when someone, even if they're blind, they have like Qur'ans in Braille. They have to review it in order to keep their memory strong. But the Prophet ﷺ never had someone do that to them. It was Jibreel alayhi salam who was teaching him. And you're going to see other verses where they brought this up as a challenge against the Prophet ﷺ, saying that someone was teaching him. But indeed, it was Jibreel alayhi salam that would review the Qur'an with him and teach him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surat Al-Ankabut, verse 43, وَمَا كُنْتَ تَتْلُو مِنْ قَبْلِهِ مِنْ كِتَابٍ وَلَا تَخُطُّهُ بِيَمِينِكَ إِذًا لَارْتَابَ الْمُبْطِلُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that the Prophet ﷺ, he never used to read books. He was not a reader. He was not into reading. وَلَا تَخُطُّ بِيَمِينِكَ, and he wasn't a writer.